On a cold November day in 1396, the grand nave of St. Paul's Cathedral flickered with the light of thousands of candles. A royal wedding was underway, celebrated with unmatched pomp. But this was no ordinary union of hearts. At the altar stood a man, Richard II, King of England, 29 years old, awaiting a bride who was still a child. Isabelle of France, just 6 years old, walked timidly down the aisle, her crown slipping on her tiny head, her future already sold. This was not a love story. It was a political transaction, an alliance sealed between two rival kingdoms. In exchange for temporary peace between England and France, a child was sacrificed on the altar of diplomacy. From that day on, Isabelle ceased to be a daughter or a child. She became a queen, a symbol, a bargaining chip. Her life would unravel through betrayal, imprisonment, forced remarriage, and ultimately, death. At the age of 20, she was a pawn, passed between empires, denied the right to her own childhood, her own happiness, her own voice. But Isabelle's tragedy is more than a chapter from a distant past. It forces us to confront an unsettling truth that echoes into our present. How entire systems, entire societies, can normalize the destruction of innocence in pursuit of power. Her story is a haunting reminder that behind every treaty, every crown, and every royal alliance, there are often children, voiceless, forgotten, and broken. Isabelle of France, the girl queen who never had a childhood, paid the ultimate price for peace. In 1396, Isabelle was only 6 years old when fate came knocking in the guise of diplomacy. England and France had been enemies for decades, locked in the brutality of the 100 Years' War. Blood had soaked the fields of both nations. But now, after years of conflict, King Richard II of England sought peace, not out of virtue, but out of necessity. Richard had recently lost his beloved wife, Anne of Bohemia. His court was fracturing. His crown hung precariously on his head as rebellion brewed beneath him. He needed an alliance that would silence his enemies at home and reassure foreign powers of England's stability. And France? France needed money. Years of war had drained the treasury, and the regents ruling in Charles VI's stead were desperate for reprieve. The solution came in the form of a child. Isabelle of France was offered as a bride to Richard II in exchange for a 28-year truce and an enormous dowry of £800,000, a sum so vast it could restore France's economy almost overnight. The negotiations were chilling in their tone. Ambassadors from both sides discussed Isabelle as though she were livestock, debating not her dreams or safety, but whether her age, 6, was too young to seal a marriage. Some English counselors suggested waiting until she turned 12, the customary age for marital consummation. But Richard, driven by political urgency, refused to delay. He needed peace now, not in 6 years. And so, the deal was struck. Isabelle, still playing with dolls and unaware of her role in this grand bargain, was traded for peace. Her future was sealed in parchment and wax, far from the nursery she should have remained in. She would cross the sea not as a daughter of France, but as its diplomatic offering, a child gift-wrapped for a foreign throne. In 1396, Isabelle was only 6 years old when fate came knocking in the guise of diplomacy. England and France had been enemies for decades, locked in the brutality of the 100 Years' War. Blood had soaked the fields of both nations. But now, after years of conflict, King Richard II of England sought peace, not out of virtue, but out of necessity. Richard had recently lost his beloved wife, Anne of Bohemia, His court was fracturing. His crown hung precariously on his head as rebellion brewed beneath him. He needed an alliance that would silence his enemies at home and reassure foreign powers of England's stability. And France? France needed money. Years of war had drained the treasury, and the regents ruling in Charles VI's stead were desperate for reprieve. The solution came in the form of a child. Isabelle of France was offered as a bride to Richard II in exchange for a 28-year truce and an enormous dowry of £800,000, a sum so vast it could restore France's economy almost overnight. The negotiations were chilling in their tone. Ambassadors from both sides discussed Isabelle as though she were livestock, debating not her dreams or safety, but whether her age, 6, was too young to seal a marriage. Some English counselors suggested waiting until she turned 12, the customary age for marital consummation. But Richard, driven by political urgency, refused to delay. He needed peace now, not in 6 years, and so the deal was struck. Isabelle, still playing with dolls and unaware of her role in this grand bargain, was traded for peace. Her future was sealed in parchment and wax, far from the nursery she should have remained in. She would cross the sea, not as a daughter of France, but as its diplomatic offering, a child gift-wrapped for a foreign throne. The departure of little Isabelle from France was not a farewell. It was a display. At the Louvre Palace, her father, Charles VI, in a rare moment of clarity, wept as he blessed his daughter. Her mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, remained characteristically cold, treating the event like a successful business transaction. For the French court, this was a political victory. For Isabelle, it was the beginning of exile. She was allowed to bring only a handful of belongings, some toys, her favorite dolls, and a small pet dog that never left her side. Surrounded by hundreds of nobles, guards, and attendants, she embarked on a grand journey to England. Every city she passed through held celebrations. Fireworks exploded, music filled the air. Local lords competed to offer the grandest receptions, but amidst the opulence, Isabelle often cried, asking when she could return home. Then came the wedding. St. Paul's Cathedral was transformed into a stage of overwhelming splendor. French and English banners intertwined. Thousands of imported candles cast golden light on Gothic walls. Choirs sang in Latin and French as nobles filled the pews. It was a diplomatic performance disguised as a sacred union. At the altar stood Richard II, dressed in golden robes that swept the marble floor. He was 29 years old, refined, cultured, and visibly uncomfortable. He had once loved deeply, and now stood beside a girl who barely reached his waist. Isabelle said nothing during the ceremony. The Archbishop of Canterbury had to kneel to slide a ring onto her tiny finger. Her eyes wandered, searching for the faces of those she knew, but found only strangers. When the crowd erupted in celebration at the moment she was declared Queen of England, she did not smile. She did not understand that her life had just been given away. Despite the grandeur of her title, Isabelle's life as Queen of England was more a continuation of childhood than queenship. Richard II, to his credit, did not treat her as a wife. He treated her like a daughter, perhaps even a symbol of lost innocence in a world that had hardened him. She was given French-speaking tutors, her own apartments at Westminster Palace, a country manor, and a small court of attendants devoted to her care. She was allowed to keep her dog and her toys. Her days were filled with language lessons, embroidery, music, activities meant to soften the harshness of her new role. Yet even in comfort, she remained a foreigner, a child draped in a crown too large in a kingdom that was not hers. Richard visited her from time to time. Their interactions, by all accounts, were gentle, respectful, distant. He never attempted to consummate the marriage, an unusual mercy in an age where political convenience often trumped morality. But Richard was not only a husband, he was a king under siege. England was unraveling. Rebellions rose. Nobles whispered in corners. The treasury was depleted, and enemies multiplied. Richard's decision to marry Isabel, seen as weakness by some, only deepened his isolation. When he was eventually overthrown in 1399 by Henry Bolingbroke, the peaceful sanctuary that Isabel had briefly known shattered instantly. At just 10 years old, Isabel became a widow. She had never truly been a wife. But her political identity now rendered her both symbol and liability. The court was unsure what to do with her. She was a queen without a king, a foreign girl with no claim, no heirs, and no future in the English succession. And worse, the massive dowry France had paid was already gone. What remained of Isabel's presence in England would no longer be ceremonial. It would be captivity. After Richard II was deposed and quietly murdered at Pontefract Castle in 1400, 10-year-old Isabel became something dangerous. A widowed queen with no power, but with a name that still carried diplomatic weight. For the new English king, Henry IV, she was both a potential bargaining chip and a lingering problem. Instead of being returned to her family in France, Isabel was placed under gentle captivity at Havering-atte-Bower, a royal manor turned gilded cage. She was allowed comforts, servants, meals, books, and quiet gardens, but she was not free. Her letters were monitored, her movements restricted. Her French attendants were replaced by English ones. Her mother tongue slowly faded into the background, and Isabel began to understand. The child who had once cried to go home now wrote letters, mature, haunting, eloquent pleas for release. In one, she wrote to her father, "I write to you in tears, for I am held here like a prisoner, far from all I love, without hope of return." These were not the words of a naive girl. They were the voice of someone who had grown up too quickly under the weight of sorrow. Her grief was layered, not just for her husband, whom she had barely known, but for the illusion of safety she had once held. The England that had crowned her with gold now held her in silence. The alliance that had cost her childhood had been shattered in months. And still, France hesitated. Reclaiming Isabel would mean confronting the failure of their diplomatic bargain, and perhaps even repaying parts of the vanished dowry. She was once again a political inconvenience. But in her father's rare moment of lucidity, he demanded her return. For once, the voice of a mad king rang with clarity. "Bring my daughter home." In the spring of 1401, after lengthy negotiations, Isabelle of France was finally allowed to return home. But the girl who had been sent away at 6 no longer existed. In her place was a solemn 12-year-old, poised, soft-spoken, and far older than her years. The long-awaited journey back to France, meant to be a return to safety, felt more like walking into exile once again. As her ship docked in Calais, Isabel did not weep with relief. She had learned to swallow tears. What awaited her on the other side of the channel was not warmth, but cold political calculation. France was still at war, still broken by internal divisions and royal instability. Her mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, received her with polite indifference, like one receiving a shipment of royal property rather than the return of a lost daughter. Her siblings had moved on. Her name, once chanted in cathedrals, was now barely whispered in court. The alliance she had embodied was now a ghost in the political memory of Europe. At the Louvre Palace, she resumed life not as a queen, but as a quiet ornament of the court. She had no crown, no titles, no role, just memories. And those memories clung to her like winter air. The choir in St. Paul's, the soft fur of her little dog, the cold nights at Havering Castle, the hollow ache of being both royalty and prisoner. And yet, Isabelle endured. In the silence of her return, she devoted herself to study and reflection. She began writing short poems in French and Latin. She spent hours in the chapel. She did not speak of England nor of Richard, but the courtiers who watched her said her eyes held a depth they could not meet for long. She was not merely a girl returned from exile. She was a ghost raised in captivity, now haunting the court that had once sold her. In 1406, when Isabelle was just 16, her mother arranged another marriage. This time the groom was Charles of Orleans, young, poetic, gentle. He was not yet the famed writer he would later become, but even in youth his soul spoke in verses, and his heart bore a softness rare in royal courts. To the world, this was just another political union, a way to tie royal bloodlines to secure land and legacy. But for Isabelle, it was something she had never known: choice. Unlike Richard II, who had towered above her like a statue carved for another world, Charles stood beside her as an equal. He listened, he smiled, and he saw her not as a treaty, not as a queen, not as a pawn, but as a person. In their short time together, something miraculous bloomed: affection. They walked gardens together. They read poetry. They whispered away from the court. For the first time in her life, Isabelle was not being prepared for someone else's future. She was simply being loved. But happiness in her world was always temporary. In 1407, just 1 year after their marriage, Charles was captured by the English during the Battle of Agincourt. He would remain imprisoned for 25 years. Once again, Isabelle was left behind, not as a widow this time, but as a wife whose husband was gone without goodbye. Locked away by the same kingdom that had once locked her. The walls of the French court closed in once more. Isabelle, now 18, faced solitude again, not with the naivety of childhood, but with the silent endurance of someone who had finally known what she had always been denied. Her love was real, her joy was real, and now her grief was too. In 1409, just 2 years after her second husband's capture, Isabelle of France died at the age of 20. The official cause was complications following childbirth. She had given birth to her only daughter, Joan of Orleans. But those who knew her said the deeper cause was exhaustion, of the body, of the spirit, of a life spent serving everyone but herself. There was no grand funeral, no cathedral filled with candles, no international mourning like the spectacle of her wedding 13 years earlier. Her death was recorded in passing by court scribes, a formality rather than a tribute. And just like that, the girl who had once been Queen of England, the girl who had been paraded through foreign cities as a symbol of peace, faded from history's spotlight. Her daughter, Joan, would grow up without knowing her father or her mother. And Isabelle, used, abandoned, silenced, would be remembered, if at all, as a diplomatic footnote. But her life was not meaningless. Isabelle's story reveals the dark undercurrent of royal politics, how children, especially girls, were treated not as lives but as leverage. Her childhood was taken from her at 6, her voice lost at 10, her freedom erased at 12. She lived entirely in service to the ambitions of men and the calculations of queens. And when she finally tasted love, it too was taken from her. Yet, in her silence, she spoke volumes. Isabelle of France stands as a symbol of the thousands of girls throughout history who were objectified, traded, and forgotten. She forces us to confront the real cost of peace, the innocents sacrificed, the lives bent, the voices never heard. She was a queen in title, a prisoner in life, and a ghost in history. But now, we remember her